Hello. I have done quite a many videos on leadership. Some of those videos discussed different leadership theories that provided you insights about why certain approach to leading can be more effective. In some of the other videos, I discussed specific techniques that you could employ to be more effective in the role of leadership. In other words, those videos have focused on what are the different things that you can do to be a good leader, to be an effective leader. In this video, though, I am focusing more on the dark side of leadership, a pretty heavy topic. And by dark side, I mean bad leadership. So in this video, we will be discussing what will make you a bad leader, an ineffective leader. Now, we will be discussing this in context of leadership ethics. This may seem like a very unusual approach to understanding leadership ethics, but I like your textbook author's choice of starting their discussion of leadership ethics with the dark side of leadership. Why? There's a lot of wisdom in trying to understand what is something by focusing our attention on what is not that thing. In Vedic philosophy, there is this approach to learning which is called neti neti. Literally, it means neither this nor that. But essentially, what that technique is talking about is an approach to finding truth by eliminating what is not truth. So if you don't exactly know what is truth, a very effective way of arriving at truth would be to eliminate anything that is not truth, and eventually you will be left with what is only truth. So that's what that approach means. So you eliminate anything that is not. So, it's not this, it's not that. So neither this, not that, not that. And that's how you eliminate everything that is not truth and finally arrive at truth. That's the Vedic approach. And that's essentially what we are doing here. To understand what ethical leadership is, we are first taking the step of what is not ethical leadership. So let's eliminate all of those things, and then we will have greater clarity about what is ethical leadership. So that's how the dark side of leadership is coming into play while we are discussing something very positive, which is the ethical approach to leading. So with that background, now let's delve into the deeper aspects of ethics and the immorality of leadership. Now, your textbook starts with a quote by Parker Palmer, who was an educational writer and consultant, and he wrote this influential essay called Leading from Within. So the authors of, or the author of your textbook quotes from Parker's essay this particular line: a leader is a person who has an unusual degree of power to create the conditions under which other people must live and move and have their being, conditions that can be either as illuminating as heaven or as shadowy as hell. A leader must take special responsibility for what's going on inside him or herself, inside his or her consciousness, lest the act of leadership create more harm than good. Now, what do you think about Parker's or Parker Palmer's statement? What are your thoughts? You can pause the video, think about it, and come back. Now, if I were to reflect on Palmer's statement, I will say that there is certainly a lot of wisdom in Palmer's statement. For example, I do agree with the point that leaders have a responsibility for the people who are working for them. And it is also true, because leaders have power, they can easily make the life of people working under them heaven or hell. So because of that, leaders have a lot of responsibility. And for leaders to not make their organizations a hell, an approach would be to go inside, to self-reflect on one's own consciousness, on one's motivations. And what Palmer is arguing is that if you do that kind of self-reflection, you are likely to be more ethical in your leadership. If you do not, then you are likely to create more harm than good. That's essentially what Palmer is talking about. But there is also something that I do not agree with in Palmer's statement, which is summarized in the statement that you see above. Palmer is essentially saying that the difference between moral and immoral leaders is as sharp as the contrast between light and darkness, between heaven and hell. And this is a direct quote from your textbook. That's a problematic statement. Why? Because morality and immorality are not as clearly distinguished as light and darkness, as heaven and hell. There's a lot of gray areas. In the extremes, yes, probably none of us will have any issue calling, let's say, Hitler an immoral leader, or Stalin an immoral leader, or Bin Laden an immoral leader, because those are extreme examples. And again, on the positive side, maybe again many of us will have no difficulty calling, say, Lincoln a moral leader. But in most circumstances, there's a lot of gray areas. For that matter, some people could argue that even these extreme examples had a lot of gray areas. Gandhi and Lincoln had shades of gray in them. They took certain decisions that could be considered potentially immoral or unethical. And same could be argued against those immoral leaders like Stalin or Hitler. There were aspects of them that had shades of, for lack of a better word, brightness, or shades of light in it as well. Again, this is not to say that they were not bad leaders. They were, and the kind of harm they caused was immense. The kind of suffering they caused was immense. And that is the reason, actually, we need to take this topic very seriously. It is not so easy to always define this is a bad leader, this is a good leader. If we take a look at our own selves, we will see that, there's a lot of positives in us, but there's also a lot of negatives in us. Many a times we do make decisions, take actions that are extremely positive, that are extremely ethical, but it's the same person who also then takes decisions or takes actions that are of questionable morality, at least, if not completely immoral. So what are those conditions under which a person, a seemingly moral person, takes decisions or takes actions that are more on the immoral side? So I don't want you to see this stark contrast between heaven and hell. Rather, I want to see this as a sliding scale. And that is what we do not want. We do not want you to slide from heaven to hell. And this can happen very easily if we are not mindful. So that's the part from Palmer's statement that I do agree with. We have to be very vigilant of our motivations, of our actions. We need to make those constant reflections so that we do not slide into the dark side, so that we do not create a worse organization or a hellish of an organization. Anyway, with that background, now let's dive into some of the technicalities, certain points that have been discussed in your textbook. So, why should we pay attention to the shadow side of leadership or the dark side of leadership? Because in our world, there are many leaders who engage in destructive behaviors. There are tons of examples, from the political leadership to business organizations leadership. Maybe even in the organization that you are working in, you may be witnessing leaders who are engaging in questionable behaviors that is impacting maybe you and others in the organization. Maybe even impacting the organization. Maybe it is destroying the organization or the department as opposed to making it better. So, destructive leadership is a fact of life. There are tons of bad leaders. So, unless we understand bad leadership, we will not be able to minimize their impact. We want to, even if we cannot completely eliminate bad leadership, we at least need to minimize the number of bad leaders in organizations, in our world. And again, remember, I'm not making this distinction between good leader versus bad leader, but even good leaders who make bad decisions, who take decisions that are of questionable morality, we want to reduce such decisions happening. So that's the reason we need to study the dark side of leadership. We don't want leaders to be abusing their power. We don't want leaders to be creating toxic work environments. Anyway, so let's discuss the 7 types of bad leaders that Barbara Kellerman talked about. So Barbara Kellerman, I believe she still is a professor at Harvard, Kennedy School of Political Leadership, I believe. So she was studying these different leaders in political positions, and but not just political positions, even in business organizations, famous leaders who messed up badly. And she came up with this 7 different types of leaders who were bad leaders because they messed things up very badly. She lists them as incompetent leaders, rigid leaders, intemperate leaders, callous, corrupt, insular, and evil leaders. Now, just listing 7 different categories can make things a little bit difficult to remember. So I have recategorized these 7 types of bad leaders into 2 broad categories here. So bad leaders can be because of broadly these 2 reasons. Either they are unable, they lack the ability to be good leaders, to be great leaders, or they are unwilling to be good leaders. So it's either a case problem with respect to ability, skill, so they lack certain abilities, certain skills that make for good leadership, or for whatever reasons they lack the motivation to engage in the good actions that would lead to good results. They are more motivated in the negative direction. So these are the two broad categories. So when it comes to lack of ability, incompetent leader, of course, is a clear case of lack of ability, right? Although Kellerman also talks about lack of motivation here sometimes, but primarily when we use the term incompetent, we mean lack of ability or lack of skill. Now, why would incompetence or lack of ability be unethical leadership? Well, to be fair, Kellerman doesn't call it unethical leadership. She calls it bad leadership, in the sense that if you're incompetent, you fail, and that is bad leadership. But one could also argue that it is unethical leadership. Let me give an example. Imagine you are a person needing surgery, and you go to a physician believing that the surgeon will be able to take care of your problem, will be able to successfully conduct the surgery so that you will recuperate. But imagine that this surgeon turns out to be a person who is extremely incompetent in the role of surgery. So in a way, we could argue that it is unethical that this person is in this position of surgery, of position of a surgeon, because of this person's incompetence. Your life is getting messed up. A lot of people are dying. So such people should not be in positions that they are occupying. So incompetence as a can have some moral or the other side immoral aspect as well. It is the responsibility of organizations or of leaders in superior positions, or for that matter of followers if they're electing a leader, to place competent people in positions of authority. And if that is not happening, then of course it will lead to all kinds of problems and, in worst cases, disasters. And there are numerous examples of incompetent leaders. I can think of many examples even from the contemporary current times, but probably I should not be discussing them. But if we think of history, Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister prior to the Second World War period, he messed up in some big ways, not recognizing the threat coming from Hitler, or rather going about trying to appease Hitler, which ultimately some of those miscalculations that he did ultimately led to the Second World War. So he is often cited as an incompetent leader. For that matter, even the CEO of Enron, about whom I had written in my last book on business ethics, is sometimes described as a person who lacked competency in terms of not having enough financial expertise. And that then causing him to make poor management decisions, which ultimately led to Enron's failure and the disaster that it caused in the economy and in the industry. So even amongst the presidents, like Jimmy Carter is sometimes described as a person who was not very competent in the role of the president, because he did not manage the inflation well during his presidentship. Inflation hit really high. There was energy crisis. He did not handle the Iranian hostage crisis well. So people have argued that he probably was not as competent a leader. I mean, similar criticisms could be made about other presidents, about other leaders as well. But the point is, if you do not have enough insights about how to lead, if you do not have the necessary qualities and the insights about the right way of leading, you will mess up. And if you mess up, you then cause a lot of problems, suffering in you and in the people whom you are leading. So if you are seeking positions of leadership, it is also your responsibility that you work on developing all those skills and knowledge that is critical to you being effective as a leader, that is critical to you being ethical leader. So anyway, that's about incompetence. If you are incompetent leader, you are a bad leader and you will mess up things. The next category is the intemperate leader. So this is a leader who does not have much self-control. These are the leaders who lack self-control. And again, there are numerous examples of leaders who have lacked self-control. In fact, just a month ago, the mayor of our town, Fort Wayne, was caught driving under influence, or rather he crashed his car while he was heavily intoxicated with alcohol. So any person should know that you should not be driving while you are drunk, while you have drunk alcohol. But this person did not have that much of self-control and ends up driving and crashing into somebody else's vehicle. So that's an example of you not having the self-control, you not knowing when to stop drinking, or even if you did drink, knowing not to drive. So anyway, that's just an example of lacking self-control. There have been other leaders who have had all kinds of similar problems. We could say Bill Clinton, the kind of disaster that he caused in the White House by engaging in the sexual acts with his intern was a lack of self-control. He did not have self-control. Just because you have an attractive intern working for you doesn't mean that you engage in sexual activities with that person, right? Because you are in a position of power, and that is abuse of power. We have had, I believe there was a mayor of Toronto who, I'm forgetting his name. I believe it was Rob Ford, who was caught smoking crack cocaine. And so anyway, these are some examples of you not having the kind of self-control. But self-control need not be about drugs or about not keeping your pants zipped. It could be about you not having the control and not having emotional control, where you, let's say, shout and abuse your followers, people working under you. So again, as a leader, it is your responsibility to develop these abilities where you are under the control of your emotions. If you are not, you will mess up. A lot of the problems that happen, unethical behaviors that happen, are because of people lacking self-control. This is something that is not discussed as often, but if you think about it, why do you get tempted, let's say, to take a bribe? Because you are not being able to hold that temptation. The temptation of receiving some benefits is much stronger than the self-control you have to say no to those temptations of pleasure, of some extra power that you will get. So that self-control, developing that self-control ability, is critical to being effective leaders. And this is something that I have discussed earlier in the context of conscientiousness, the personality trait of conscientiousness. People who are high on that dimension, they tend to have higher self-control. I have discussed this in context of delaying gratification, the many experiments that have been done on delaying gratification. If you do not have the ability to delay gratification, then you will not be able to succeed in a big way. So anyway, lack of self-control, which is called intemperate leadership, is one of the reasons why, again, leaders fail. Now, coming to the other side of the spectrum, when we are talking about lack of motivation or people lacking the motivation to engage in the good behaviors, the first thing is called rigid leadership. These are leaders who are fixed in their ways. They are unyielding. Just because they had succeeded in the past, they have now become extremely fixed in their ways. They are not ready to change their approach. They are not malleable enough. And that then leads them to mess up things in a very bad way or in a big way. The examples that come to mind is Blockbuster's CEO, right? John Antioco. He got the offer from Netflix to, Netflix was, I believe, willing to sell their DVD mail service for some $50 million. And he said, no, this is not going to make it big. So he just declined the offer. He even later on declined the offer of Blockbuster hosting the online Netflix services. And ultimately, that was the reason Blockbuster went out of business. It did not adapt to the changing circumstances, changing situations. And there are numerous such other examples where if you are unyielding, if you are just set in your ways, if you are not ready to listen to alternative perspectives, then you could potentially mess up as a leader, even if you had been successful. In fact, if you have had too many successes, that can blind you to such positions where you become unwilling to listen to others. So that's rigid leadership. Then we have insular leadership. And by insular leadership, what we are saying, or what rather Kellerman is saying, is that these are leaders who make a distinction between us and others, right? Insiders and outsiders. So these are leaders who make such distinctions. Hitler did that, right? He called the Jews as outsiders. So if you are the German Aryan, then you are one of us. If you are a Jew, you are not one of us, and you get exterminated. Many religions, unfortunately, have this as one of their core philosophy. If you believe in my God, then you are good. Otherwise, you either need to be converted or you need to be killed, eliminated. So this is the kind of insular thinking that has caused millions of deaths over the past several centuries. So in fact, insular leadership that you see here is, I would say, one of the primary reasons that we see evil leadership. So insular leadership would be, of course, Hitler, as I said, was a great example. Stalin was again, insular leader. In the recent news, we have even, the Turkish president Erdogan has been criticized for being insular, again, making this distinction between people from certain religions being part of the in-group and others being out-group. So anytime we see such insularity, that often leads to, not always, but it often leads to the extreme situation where you are then not even hesitating to commit these most horrible kind of atrocities against the outsiders. It typically is difficult for people to commit these extremely horrible atrocities for people who you think are your own, right? So insularity, even though Kellerman separates it from evil leaders, I would say is a big problem, because insularity often leads to these kind of evil leaders. Then Kellerman also talks about callous leaders, and by that essentially she is meaning leaders who are uncaring, unkind. And we know from our discussion on leadership how important these relationship-oriented behaviors are if you want to be effective as a leader. How important it is to genuinely, authentically care for your followers, for the people who are working under you. Individualized consideration, right? That's one of the key components of transformational leadership. This is also discussed in authentic leadership. It's also discussed in servant leadership. But then, either because of lack of ability, some leaders being because of extremely low on the agreeableness dimension. In that case, it is less of a lack of motivation and more a lack of ability to, right? But for whatever reason, if you are uncaring, you don't care for your followers, you don't care for the people working under you, or for the society, then you create again hell. So, and sometimes this goes back to the point where I started with about that shades of gray. Some of the very successful leaders actually have been uncaring and unkind too. Like the person that immediately comes to mind is Steve Jobs. He was extremely brutal when it came to dealing with many of his employees. Some would, call him an asshole. Many would call him the approach that he took when it came to leading people. He was on the other extreme too. And for those who were doing the kind of jobs that, or succeeding in kind of meeting his expectations, for them, he was extremely nice. He provided them with the best of opportunities. But for many of the others, he just didn't care. He was extremely demanding, abusive. So we can see this uncaring, unkind kind of leadership. So you can see there's a lot of interrelatedness between many of these topics. Like somebody lacking self-control emotionally, right? They can be also callous leaders, right? So you don't have any. Even Bill Clinton was criticized for this. He would lose his temper on the people working in the White House. He would shout at them. Extremely abusive towards them. This has been reported. So lack of self-control could then make you very uncaring. Or if you do not care, you would then not even care about how you present yourself towards your employees, right? So these are not as distinct points. They do impact each other. Insularity can impact you to become more evil. Insularity, incompetency can be leading to you becoming more insular, and so on and so forth. So they are interrelated. A corrupt leader is a person who is a leader who is primarily interested in self and maybe his immediate family, making more money at the cost of the organization, at the cost of people. And again, there have been numerous corrupt leaders. Many in Suharto, I think he was from Indonesia. He just siphoned off billions of dollars. Then Marcos from Philippines. The Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak was also convicted of corruption. In Pakistan, there have been several leaders, including the military leadership, who have been found to be corrupt. So, and for that matter, even in the United States, just because I gave some examples from across the world doesn't mean that there haven't been corrupt leaders in US or in the West. There have been tons of corrupt leaders here too. People siphoning off money, public money. And the other big problem is that in the US, often certain words are used to hide corruption. Like, they will use the term lobbying to give money to politicians so that they will do work for them. And that is called money. That is called lobbying. Whereas in a way, that is essentially what corruption is. You, as a business organization, are paying essentially a kind of bribe to a political leader so that your self-interest as an organization is getting fulfilled, and not necessarily that of the general public. So in any case, corruption is a problem where the leaders are primarily concerned about their own self-interest. They don't care. Again, you can see the connection between uncaring and corruption. You don't care about others. All you care about is yourself, right? You making more money. So, and evil leaders are the ones who commit those horrible crimes. They treat people horribly. Need not be always leading to deaths, but even causing huge psychological damage. So these are the 7 types of bad leaders that Kellerman talked about. So again, as far as possible, you should not be falling into any of these categories, or you should try your most to minimize uh, any of these tendencies that you may see developing in yourself at any point of time. Now, this is from another study. This was by some scholars, researchers working at the University of Bond in Australia. They did a study on regular leaders working in organizations, and they did what is called a statistical technique called cluster analysis, and they surveyed lots of leaders in many different kinds of organizations in different kinds of positions, and they found these 7 major clusters of destructive leader behaviors. These clusters are not as distinct from each other, so it's a little problematic, but leaving aside the structural soundness of these clusters, they do provide some great insights about the kind of destructive leadership behaviors we tend to see in people in leadership positions. So you may be destructive. One of the problem is that you make poor decisions. Again, you could be making poor decisions because of you lacking competence, or you not being aware of many things that you should be aware of, but you made poor decisions, that, or you deliberately lie or engage in unethical behavior for your own benefit or to hide a mistake. So these are distinct points. Making poor decision could be because of incompetence, but lying, deliberately lying or engaging in unethical behavior could be for corruption reasons. You want to benefit yourself or want to hide some mistake that you have done against others. But either way, even though they are distinct points, they are included under one cluster. The point is that, yes, these are both factors that are problematic behaviors in leaders. Cluster 2 talks about leaders lacking in critical skills, critical thinking skills. If you cannot critically think about what is right, what's not right, again, you will mess up. You not being able to motivate your subordinates, that's again a lack of ability or skill. As a leader, you need to develop those abilities to be able to motivate, to be able to inspire your subordinates to work hard, to strive for the goal that you have for the organization. And if you do not, then that's a problematic behavior. Sometimes you may have leaders who do make good decisions, but they are extremely micromanaging, over-controlling. That's problematic too. Again, we know that leads to people getting demotivated. They feel they are being controlled too much. So it's engaging in those excessive task-oriented behaviors. Leaders making those decisions all by themselves. Sometimes you do need to involve others in the decision-making process, right? Again, there is a place importance for making decisions on one's own, but again, you know this from the different theories that I've discussed before. But if that's the only approach you take and you are always micromanaging, over-controlling followers, that's problematic. Some leaders have big problems dealing with conflict. They avoid conflict, maybe because of they being very high on the agreeableness dimension. Those are the people who tend to, have this problem of avoiding conflict, or for whatever reason. But then that leads to bigger problems down the lane, right? So, as a leader, it is your responsibility to be able to face conflict, even if it is unpleasant. No one likes conflict, but you should be able to face it and deal with it, even if it is a bitter pill. You have to be willing to deal with conflict. When you don't, it leads to all kinds of problems. Playing favorites. Again, this is a different point from dealing with conflict. But if you are playing favorites, again, it's okay from you would remember from my lecture in the leader-member exchange. It's okay to have a follower whom you trust more because he or she has been more effective. But playing favorites, where you are unfairly favoring somebody, despite others having the merits, despite others having despite others making those kind of contributions that you want people to make. That is the kind of problematic behavior that we are talking about here. And sometimes leaders are what they call cluster 5. Leader is neither good nor bad. They are the kind of mediocre leaders. And there's tons of mediocrity we can see in organizations. And that itself can be problematic. So there are other leaders who isolate their groups from the rest of the organization. We tend to see this especially in some of those narcissistic leaders who seclude you from others so that they can manipulate you, or they can continue to exploit you, and but then of course you as a follower are losing out on many opportunities. So this is another dark side of leadership that has been observed. And then in the extreme, similar to evil leadership, there can be leaders who are extremely brutal. They are literal bullies who try to harm their followers, or who harm their followers either psychologically or physically. So these are some of the different kinds of destructive leadership behaviors that were observed by the researchers at University of Bonn. This was another study. This was, I believe, from Sweden. Yeah, I think it was from Sweden. So Einarsson and his associates, they categorized 4 different categories of destructive leaders. One is the tyrannical leader. These are the leaders who are primarily focused on achieving the organization's goals at the cost of the followers, at the cost of the employees. So they don't care about the employees. All they care about is the organization's profits. So they essentially become extremely tyrannical. So if you are so focused on, wow, some nice weather or bright weather in midst of rains. In any case, sorry for the distraction. That's about tyrannical leaders. They're so focused on only profits, making more money, that they do not care about the followers. They end up abusing the followers, and that's tyrannical leaders. Then we have the supportive, disloyal leaders. These are leaders who care for the welfare of the subordinates, but at the expense of the organization's goals, right? So anyway, I think it's, let me show the next slide, which will probably give you greater insight about what Einarsson's different types of destructive leaders are. So we'll start with the tyrannical leaders again, okay? So Einarsson essentially have 2 broad dimensions. So as a leader, either you are focused primarily on the organization's profits, right? That's the pro-organization. On the opposite extreme, you do not care about the organization at all. Similarly, you could be either pro-subordinate, meaning you care a lot about the subordinate, or other extreme is you do not care about the subordinate. So these are the possible options that can be there, right? So the first category that we see here is that of the tyrannical leadership. This leader is only caring about profits, pro-organization, but not caring about the subordinate. So that's what leads to the tyrannical leadership. Then the supportive, disloyal leadership is only caring about the subordinate, but at the expense of the organization. That's supportive, disloyal leadership. Again, you can imagine this is similar to the leadership grid that I had discussed in one of my previous lectures. High task, low relationship. That's the similarity to tyrannical leadership. And this high relationship, low task is kind of the similarity to subordinate, disloyal leadership. So those are the kind of parallels that you can think of. And we have then some other leaders like which would equivalent of low task, low relationship. They will be the derailed leadership, right? So they literally derail organization because they neither care for the organization nor for the subordinate. They probably only care for themselves. So that's the derailed leadership. The constructive leadership, this is not bad leadership. This is the kind of positive leadership that they are talking that you should be having, where you are both pro-organization as well as pro-subordinate. So, but Einarsson talked about 4 different kinds of bad leaders, and the 4th kind was the laissez-faire. And the laissez-faire would essentially fit into the middle, where you are not leading, you are just letting things happen. You are neither caring for the organization nor working consciously anti-organization. So you're just letting things happen. You are not leading at all. That's problematic too, or that is kind of mediocrity that we sometimes see in leadership. And that's the fourth category of problematic or destructive leadership. So anyway, this gives you some greater insights about other forms of dark leadership. Essentially, though, if we come to this summary of all this discussion, leaders are bad leaders when they abuse power or when they hoard privileges. So they want all the benefits for themselves. They are not sharing it with the rest of the organization or with the general public. They are keeping everything for themselves. Mismanaging information. A lot of problems have happened because of mismanaging information. Again, I think I should discuss each of these points in greater detail. So power is a topic that I have discussed in several of my past lectures. Power sometimes is considered very negatively, but power, you would remember, is not necessarily automatically bad, right? Power is the capacity to influence others. If you do not have the capacity to influence others, you cannot influence others, which means no leadership can happen if you do not have power. So power is good. And we have discussed in many of my other lectures about the different sources of power. And there are others too, but these were the first 5 ones that were identified by French and Raven. So I have discussed in my previous lectures that you ought to have power, and you could get it either from achieving some positions where you can either punish people for they not doing their work or for their mistakes, or reward people for their doing a good job, or just by being in the position of authority, people will be willing to follow you. So these are more sources of what we can call hard power, or more positional power, right? And this is not necessarily bad, because you do need to be able to sometimes punish people when they mess things up, or when your follower, let's say, engages in some unethical activity. You should be penalizing the person, right? So that is important, and that is what you ought to do as a leader. So even coercive power is not necessarily bad. And again, if you have the power to reward people when they are doing well, that will make you more influential. That will help you motivate your followers to work harder. So these are all good things. And we had talked about more soft sources of power, like expert power, where you have the knowledge and skills because of which then people want to follow you, or you being the perfect role model, the referent power, which is the most powerful of the 5 sources, right? People are following you because they admire you, they respect you. That's referent power, right? So anyway, the problem with power is that it can be abused, right? So while power is a good thing, it's a great thing to have, we do see that the greater the power you have, there is a greater potential of you being able to abuse it. If you do not have any power, of course, then you cannot abuse it. But power automatically should not be considered negative, right? People who have less power, it's not that they are more moral or more ethical than people who have higher power. Just that people who have less power, they have limited scope to abuse it, right? So you probably only will be able to steal some stationery from your desk, if that's the level of power you have. If you are the CEO, you probably will be able to siphon off millions of dollars. But if you are one of those persons who steals stationery, office stationery, which is supposed to be used, which meant to be used in the office, and you take it for some personal use at home, you are still abusing your power, right? Now you have only limited resources. That's the reason you are being able to abuse it only to a smaller extent. Somebody who has more power is being able to abuse it to a greater extent. So my point is, you should not automatically negate power. You need power to be effective as a leader. The more power you have, the greater degrees of freedom you have, the greater capacity you have to influence people. So power is not automatically bad, but the greater the power you have, if you start abusing that power, then you will cause greater harm. So that's the dark side of power. That's the shadow side of power. So while a small, less powerful leader in an organization will not be able to cause the kind of harm But if you are in a position of power because of either you being in some high position, or even you being that strong charismatic personality, more people willing to follow you, if you start abusing power, then you will cause greater damage, bigger damage. That's what we have seen, let's say, amongst those so-called spiritual teachers who end up killing hundreds of people, right? Making their followers take decisions that ultimately leads to their death. So, but why do we see the abuse of power? And there can be numerous reasons why this happens. And this is something that we will be discussing in greater detail in my next lecture. But when people have power, there is some evidence of they becoming more selfish, or is it the other way around? Selfish people seek power, right? There is evidence for that as well. But once you have that power, then you want to protect it. Anyone who comes in your way, who can take away that power, you see them as a threat, and that then makes you become even more abusive. So, and when you have too much of power, there's some lot of research about how it can change the way you think. It can literally bias you. And again, if I start talking about all those research, I will deviate from the topic. But yes, a power can change your worldview about things, both in positive as well as negative ways. And the negative ways is that it could potentially cause a lot of self-entitlement. You could start believing that it is only because of you have earned everything that you have gotten, which actually is rarely ever the case. Despite you being extremely competent, despite you having worked hard, there are numerous others, hundreds of other people who are extremely competent, who have also great work ethics, work hard. They haven't been lucky enough to reach the kind of position that you have reached, right? So just assuming that you have earned everything and you then deserve the privileges that you are getting, that then leads you to becoming more abusive. This is also related to the second point, which is the shadow of privilege, right? Your textbook talks about some of the huge disparity that we see in the pays of in the salaries of the CEOs versus the regular employees. In the US, the top 1% of the earners, their income, again according to your textbook, is more than 40 times that of the people who are in the bottom 90%, right? And this gap is widening even more. Your textbook gives some examples of the huge fat pay that many of the CEOs earn, going into hundreds of dollars, not hundreds, but hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And these leaders get this pay even if they fail as a leader. Even when they are thrown out from their position of a CEO, they continue to make a lot of money. So the system is a little bit skewed, or I shouldn't say a little bit, it's heavily skewed. But at the same time, I do not want to create this hatred against the top 1% just because we are not in that top 1%, right? So my point is more about critiquing the problematic actions of leaders, and critiquing the system that doesn't care for people who are on the bottom rung. So a CEO earning millions of dollars is not much of a problem. All of us would agree that a leader probably deserves more compensation than somebody who is not a leader. The problem happens when this person who is in this top position fires people, 20% or 30% of the workforce, just to show more profits for these stock market, which then raises the market share, not the market share, but the stock value of the company, which then makes even more millions of dollars for the shareholders and for the CEO. So the higher earnings of the top CEOs come at the cost of the life of people in the bottom rung. That's what is problematic. And as I said, if you succeed, that sometimes create a sense of entitlement, that sense of privilege, that you have earned it, that you deserve it, and that actually then leads you to become uncaring for people, and that's the shadow that we are talking about here. Then there is the point of mismanaged information. You know, from one of my other you would remember from one of my other lectures on power, about information being a source of power, right? So French and Raven, of course, discussed those 5 sources of power that we discussed before: coercive power, reward power, legitimate power, expert power, and referent power. But later on, they added another source of power, which is information power. So you being privy to certain information can give you a lot of power, and that again is an abuse of power when you have that information. If you release that information to the wrong people, who can then make more money from that information, that's problematic. Right now with the social media, this is even a bigger problem, right? Facebook shared a lot of information to, I think, what was it called, Cambridge Analytica, who was then manipulating the ads that people were seeing, which then influenced people's voting behavior. So all these kinds of unethical acts can come into play when we are talking about mismanaged information. And sometimes, again, of your textbook talks about denying having the knowledge that they had the information when they actually did, right? So that's a problematic behavior. Or withholding information that should have been shared with the followers, or using the information only for personal benefit, like it happens when it comes to insider trading, violating people's rights of their privacy. That's another form of mismanaged information. Releasing information to the wrong people, which I just shared. And putting followers in ethical binds by preventing them from releasing information that others have a legitimate right to know. So, for example, you have a right to know about the kind of research development that is happening, about the problematic effects of a particular drug, but the organization or the CEO of the pharma company may not release that information so that they can continue to sell what they are selling, right? So that's an example of this kind of information for which you have a legitimate right to know, but then they're not releasing this information. And there are problems even bigger. Sometimes organizations deliberately manipulate information. That's something that wasn't mentioned in the textbook, but that is another big problem. We have had the case of Twitter. The previous people who were in charge at the organization, they were deliberately deleting or banning people who belonged to a particular political affiliation, especially if they were on the right side of the political affiliation. Twitter was automatically banning them or shadow banning them, right? So this is all mismanaged information, which is unethical. And this is the mismanaged information was not as big a problem earlier, but it is becoming a bigger problem now, especially with the importance that information now has in this current globalized world. Anyway, inconsistency. If you are not being consistent as a leader in your approach about how you are leading. So, for example, consistency is a big component of fairness, right? And procedural fairness. You have to be consistent. You cannot have separate rules for separate people. So, if you are inconsistent, you are creating more unfairness in the system. You may be taking actions or decisions arbitrarily or in favor of a particular person or a particular group. And this is unethical or destructive leadership behavior. At one point of time, we may have seen such inconsistencies against a particular group of people. Now we may be seeing it in the opposite direction, but nonetheless, they are both inconsistent, unfair behavior. Such unfairness against many so-called protected groups. So if you are from a particular protected group, you may be able to get away with saying things or doing things that are problematic for the organization. But if you are not in that protected group, you may get penalized. You may lose your job, right? So this inconsistency can also be a big problem. This is unethical. This is, again, an example of destructive leadership, because as a leader, it is important for you to stay fair, and fairness is not just about giving special privileges to people. Misplaced broken loyalties. So as a leader, you are responsible for your family, for your community, the profession, the larger society, the environment, but many a times you are not aware of these different stakeholders, and you may ignore a particular group of stakeholders. For example, you may ignore the community completely and focus primarily on profits. Or for that matter, you may be a huge workaholic and just focus on your work and completely ignore your responsibility towards your family. That's problematic too, right? So this balancing of the different stakeholders is extremely important. When you do not balance these different stakeholders properly, because of numerous reasons, most often because of your selfish interest, you are creating more problems in the organization. So that's destructive leadership. A good example that your textbook talks about is the allegations of, not just allegations, but the people, the Catholic priests who have been found to be engaging in pedophilia, and then the institution not taking strong actions against them. That's misplaced loyalty. The institution is seeing that they are loyal to retaining the prestige of the institution at the cost of the suffering that these kids are going through, right? So that's a big problem. The last point that your textbook talks about is the shadow of irresponsibility. As leaders, of course, we are responsible for the organization that we are leading, for the people whom we are leading. But how much of responsibility do leaders have for, let's say, the misdeeds of the followers? Sometimes it is not as clear. Let's say one of my students copies on the exam. Now, am I responsible for that? Should I be blamed for that? Well, I may not necessarily be blamed because it was my student who did the cheating, not me. But I could still be responsible if I did not take adequate steps to prevent cheating behavior amongst students, right? Or I'm still responsible if I did not take proper actions after I found that somebody was cheating. So, as leaders, you are not necessarily always responsible. A CEO should not be fired if some employee committed some misdeed, right? But as the CEO, as the leader, you are still responsible. Response plus able. You have the ability to respond to those situations in a ethical manner, in a timely manner, in a way that minimizes damage, that reduces the probability that such problematic behaviors occur again in the future, right? So those things you are responsible for. And these are the kind of discussions that we tend to have when we are talking about the shadow of irresponsibility. Now, the last thing that we will talk is even the followers, they have a responsibility to create that ethical climate in organizations. We cannot just talk about leaders' ethics and leaders' unethical behavior. Followers do contribute to it as well. And you will remember this from my lecture on followership. If you haven't, do check it out. Followers have a huge responsibility. The challenge of obligation that your textbook talks about. How much is the follower responsible for the work that is happening in organizations? There are some followers who do not even take the minimal responsibilities. They do not show up on time to work. They do not carry through the work that they are responsible for. They may be loafing at work by spending time on some social media, or not actually doing the work. That's a problem, right? We cannot just blame the leader for let's say the poor performance of your department, of your organization. The follower is responsible as well. So that's what we are talking about here. The follower is also obliged to work, to take up responsibilities so that the organization succeeds. Sure, the leader has greater amount of responsibility, but the follower has responsibility as well. But the opposite extreme of it is, we should not be, again, you should not be, if you are a follower, you should not be taking too much of responsibility either. Like if you're working 80, 90 hours per week, which is sometimes, which is not uncommon in many industries, that will also cause you to burn out. As a follower, again, you will not be able to balance the multiple responsibilities that you have, let's say family and other things. And if you burn out, then again, that leads to you not being productive in a long-term fashion. So this balancing is really important. The challenge of obedience. As a follower, it is your duty to obey the orders that are coming from your superiors, from your leaders. But blindly obeying orders, that's problematic. You cannot evade responsibility of having engaged in some unethical or immoral behavior just because it was your leader who ordered that action, right? You as a follower also have responsibility to figure out what is right, what is not right, and act from your ethical, moral compass. So that again, that balancing, knowing when to obey, when not to obey, that is again critical. The challenge of cynicism. Healthy skepticism is good. Do not just blindly agree with anything a charismatic leadership is saying. That is good. But again, you should not be going in the other extreme either, where you are a cynical person who is cynical about anything and everything, right? Just because the ideas are coming from a particular leader whom you do not like, you should not be against anything and everything that the person says. There may be lots of merits in some of the points that the leader is making, right? So that balancing again between healthy skepticism and unhealthy cynicism, that needs to be done if you want to be your organization to be more ethical, if you want your leaders to be more ethical. If you want your leaders to be more ethical, again, you have a duty to voice your thoughts, your opinions. Anytime the leader is messing up, making problematic decisions, you have a responsibility to voice those concerns. But at the same time, you should not slide to the other extreme where you are a person who is always complaining about anything and everything, right? So that becomes dysfunctional voice. The challenge of bad news. It is your responsibility as a follower to deliver bad news, right? Some mess up happens. Instead of trying to hide it, you should report it to the leader so that the leader then can take appropriate actions. If the leader doesn't even know about some mess up that happened in your department, then how can the leader be held responsible for fixing those issues? So as a follower, it becomes your responsibility to not hide bad news and delivering them timely. But even here, there may be that balancing or that wisdom that needs to be there from the follower, right? Knowing how to deliver bad news. It's not just about delivering bad news, but how to deliver it, when to deliver it, so that you have greater receptivity from the leader. So all these things come into play when we are talking about making an organization that is ethical, that is good, and minimizing the extent of bad leadership in organizations and in our society. So we will stop it here. There's more that we will be talking in the future lectures. In the future lectures, we will focus more on the why aspect of it. In other words, why do certain people engage in more ethical behaviors? Why do certain leaders tend to slide more into the dark side of leadership? Or in other words, why do certain leaders engage in more unethical behaviors? And what possible steps could we take to maximize leaders' actions in the ethical direction and to minimize leaders' actions in the unethical directions? Some of those points is what we will be talking. We touched upon some of those points even today, but we will dive into greater detail on those points. in the next video. Thank you.